The mission was supposed to be routine. On a cold, pale morning over occupied Europe, a British bomber squadron carved through the clouds, engines humming in steady unison. Among them was Flight Lieutenant Arthur Miles, a young but seasoned pilot known for his calm nerves and flawless landings. Inside his aircraft, the crew joked, checked instruments, and prepared for their bombing run. Nothing unusual, no warning signs, just the steady rhythm of war. Then, the sky exploded. A burst of enemy flak ripped upward, shredding metal like paper. The aircraft lurched violently to the side. Flames roared across the left wing. Control cables snapped with whip-like cracks. The cockpit filled with smoke so thick it turned the sunrise into a red blur. Arthur grabbed the control column and felt his stomach drop. It wasn't responding, not even a little. The bomber was burning, diving, twisting toward the earth with a mind of its own. In the headset, the crew shouted, "We're losing her. Controls are gone. We have to bail out." But Arthur Miles refused to give up. He didn't even reach for his parachute, because below them, barely visible through the smoke, lay miles of enemy territory. If his crew jumped now, they'd be captured, or worse. Somehow, some way, Arthur had to save the aircraft. He had to land a burning plane with no working controls. And in the chaos of the falling cockpit, one impossible thought cut through the fear. There has to be a way. I'm not letting them die today. The bomber spiraled downward, every rotation pulling Arthur and his crew closer to the ground. Warning lights flashed violently across the cockpit panel. Hydraulics failing, oil pressure dropping, engine temperature spiking. Arthur fought the control column again. Nothing. It was like trying to steer a brick in free fall. Behind him, the navigator shouted over the roar of the flames, "Arthur, we have to jump. The controls aren't responding at all." But Arthur wasn't ready to surrender the aircraft, not while there was even the tiniest chance he could save his men. He scanned the cockpit, the fire, the smoke, the shaking airframe that felt like it would tear apart at any second. Then he saw it. A thin cable, frayed and glowing from heat, dangling from the ceiling like a broken nerve. That was the moment he understood. Every control line was severed. The bomber was flying itself now straight into a death dive. Arthur made the call. "Nobody jumps, not yet. Give me 1 more minute." That 1 minute felt like a lifetime as the ground rushed closer. The crew clung to their positions, trusting him with their lives, even as the cockpit windows cracked from the heat. The aircraft was transforming into a falling, burning coffin, and Arthur knew he had only seconds to figure out a miracle. And then, through the chaos, an idea sparked. A dangerous idea. A desperate idea. A completely insane idea. But it was the only one they had left. The bomber was dropping fast. Too fast. Altitude. Falling. Speed. Rising. Fire. Spreading. Every warning instrument was screaming. And in the middle of that chaos, Arthur's eyes locked onto something no pilot ever paid attention to during flight. The trim wheel. A small metal disc on the console, normally used for tiny adjustments. Nothing more. But now, it was the only moving control left. The main control cables were gone. The rudder pedals were dead. The ailerons weren't responding. The elevator was useless. And yet, the trim wheel still moved. Barely. Stiff. Half melted. But it moved. Arthur's mind raced. If the elevator is gone, but the trim still works, then maybe, just maybe, he could force the bomber to level out using only the trim tabs, tiny metal flaps never meant to steer a whole aircraft. The navigator saw what he was trying to do. "Arthur, you can't land a plane on trim." He was right. Nobody ever had. Pilots trained for every emergency, except this one. But Arthur grabbed the wheel with both hands anyway. It burned his palms. It shook violently. It fought him with every turn, yet slowly, painfully, the nose of the bomber began to lift. Not much, not enough, just a few degrees, but enough to stop the death spiral. The crew felt the sudden shift. The plane steadied only slightly, but enough to give them a chance. It wasn't flying, it was surviving. Arthur shouted, "Hold on. I can keep her level, but landing this thing will be another story." They were still losing altitude, still on fire, still without controls. But now, for the first time in minutes, they weren't falling, they were fighting back. The bomber was now barely stable, gliding more than flying. Arthur kept one hand on the smoking trim wheel, the other hovering over the dead controls out of pure instinct. Every movement required force. Every adjustment was a gamble. Every second mattered. Below them stretched the English Channel dark water, rough waves, impossible to ditch in a burning, crippled aircraft. The crew knew it. The navigator leaned forward. "Arthur, we won't reach land at this rate." He was right. The trim method could keep the plane level, but not climb, not turn, not evade, just delay the inevitable. Arthur scanned the skyline, eyes burning from the smoke creeping into the cockpit. Then he spotted something, a lone strip of land, flat, open, a field maybe large enough to crash land. But they had a new problem. They were heading slightly off course, and the pilot had no way to turn. The bomber was locked into one direction like a runaway train. Unless Arthur grabbed the engine throttles. If he couldn't steer with the wings, maybe he could steer with power. He pushed the left engine forward, pulled the right engine back. The plane shuddered violently. Metal groaned. The whole airframe twisted like it might tear apart. But then the nose began to swing, slowly, painfully. But it turned. The crew watched in stunned silence. Arthur was now flying a massive burning bomber, using nothing but engine power, a trim wheel, and pure will. No flight school taught this. No manual covered this. No pilot had ever attempted this combination at this low altitude. But it was working. They were aligning with the field. Barely. The flames crawled further up the fuselage. The cockpit windows cracked from the heat. The smell of burning insulation filled every breath. The radio operator whispered, "Arthur, whatever you're doing, don't stop." When Studevaling, he wasn't planning to. But landing would be a different nightmare entirely. Because getting the plane near the field was one thing. Putting a burning plane with no controls onto the ground was something no one had survived before. Arthur had managed the impossible. He had steered a burning, uncontrollable bomber toward a flat landing field. But now came the hardest part, landing, a task that even a fully functional bomber often failed at. And this one had no ailerons, no elevators, no rudder M, half a wing burned, fire spreading toward the fuel tanks, cracking windows and smoke filling the cockpit. And they were descending too fast. The crew held on as the ground rose toward them. Arthur glanced only once at the altimeter. It was dropping fast. "Brace," he said. He didn't shout. There was no panic in his voice. Just a calm, focused command. He pulled the trim wheel as far back as it would go, forcing the tail to rise, nose to lift, forming a shallow glide. But that was only part of it. To soften the descent, he pushed both throttles forward. Not enough to climb, just enough to catch the aircraft, slowing its fall. The bomber responded, barely. The nose lifted another degree. The burning wing creaked under the added airflow. 50 meters. The field was close enough to see individual blades of grass whipping in the wind. The tail gunners were silent. The navigator clutched his charts tightly. The radio operator crossed himself. Arthur made micro adjustments. More power right engine, less on the left. Adjust pitch with trim. Fight the burning. Asymmetric drag. The aircraft wobbled like a wounded animal. The ground rushed up, 20 meters. The wheels weren't even down. There was no time and no guarantee they'd lock. This would be a belly landing. Arthur eased the throttles back, searching for the sweet point between stalling and slamming into the earth. 10 meters. The entire crew felt the bomber losing lift. The left wing, half burned, began to dip dangerously. If it touched the ground first, the bomber would cartwheel and explode. Arthur shoved the right engine to full. The plane groaned, straightened. 5 meters. The world slowed. Arthur held the trim wheel with both hands, muscles screaming, forcing the nose up. Impact. A deafening scrape of metal tearing across earth. Sparks. Flame. A violent skid that threw the crew forward. The bomber slid across the field, digging deep scars into the dirt. Then finally, it stopped. Silence. For 1 second. None of them moved. Then came the sound they feared most. Whoosh. The fire reached the main fuel tank. They had only seconds. The bomber lay crippled in the field, half its fuselage on fire. Metal warped from the crash landing. The crew, dazed and bruised, struggled to process the fact that they were still alive. Arthur didn't have that luxury, because he heard it, the unmistakable roar of flames reaching the fuel tank. They had maybe 10 seconds. He unstrapped himself instantly. "Out! Now!" he shouted, voice hoarse from smoke. The navigator kicked the side hatch. It jammed. The radio operator slammed his shoulder into it. It barely budged. Arthur climbed over a twisted section of cockpit frame and put all his weight into it. The hatch snapped open. Smoke spilled out like a wave. The first explosion hit. Not the big one, just a warning blast from a fuel line igniting. Boom. A shock wave rattled the entire aircraft. "Go!" Arthur shoved the nearest crewman through the hatch. They spilled out into the tall grass one by one. The navigator, the radio operator, the tail gunner, the bombardier. Limbs, shaking, coughing, limping, but moving. The second blast shook the ground beneath them. The fire was now climbing the fuselage like a fuse racing toward a bomb. Arthur turned back toward the cockpit. The co-pilot was still inside, unconscious, slumped over his seat. There was no time, no oxygen, no visibility, just fire. Arthur dove back into the inferno without hesitation. The heat hit him like a wall, nearly knocking him down. He wrapped his arms around the co-pilot's chest and dragged him toward the hatch. The man was dead weight. Flames licked the ceiling. The cockpit roof groaned, threatening to collapse. Arthur reached the hatch. Boom! A third explosion rocked the bomber, flinging debris past his face. He half carried, half threw the co-pilot through the opening and jumped after him. He landed on the dirt as the crew grabbed the unconscious man and pulled him away. They ran 10 meters, 20, 30. Then, the main fuel tank let go. A massive fireball consumed the aircraft, lighting up the entire field. The shock wave knocked them to their knees, but they were alive. All of them. Arthur lay in the grass, chest heaving, looking at the burning wreckage of the bomber he had somehow landed. The radio operator, still coughing, turned to him. "Arthur, no one is ever going to believe this." He was right, but the story was only beginning, because the RAF would soon launch an investigation. How had a pilot with no controls flown and landed a burning bomber? The answer would shock even veteran pilots. The crew was taken to a nearby RAF station for medical checks. Burns, bruises, smoke inhalation. Nothing unusual for a crash landing. What was unusual was the message waiting for them. Pilot to report immediately to operations. Arthur walked into the briefing room, still covered in soot. Inside were 2 senior RAF flight officers, an engineering inspector, and a representative from Bomber Command. Their faces were serious. The inspector opened with a question Arthur wasn't prepared for. "Lieutenant, how did you land an aircraft with no control surfaces?" Arthur blinked. "No control surfaces, sir?" The engineer pushed a clipboard forward. Photos taken at the crash site. Elevators. Melted through melted. Aileron cables. Snapped and burned. Rudder linkage. Gone. Left wing. Partially collapsed. Hydraulics. Completely destroyed. The senior officer folded his arms. "According to these photos, your aircraft should have rolled, spiraled, and crashed into the channel," another officer added. "And according to your crew, you not only flew it, you steered it, lined up a landing, and touched down level." Arthur explained everything. How the controls failed instantly. How he discovered the trim wheel still worked. How he used engine power to create differential thrust to create. How he fought the burning drag on the left wing drag. How he kept the nose up with trim alone, How he improvised a landing sequence with no visibility. The room was silent. Most pilots would have panicked. Many would have bailed out over the channel. Some would have tried to ditch and died in the cold water. What Arthur attempted and survived was something no one had documented before. The Bomber Command representative finally spoke. "Lieutenant Ward, in our records, this type of event has a survival rate of 0. Arthur swallowed. "And your landing," the officer continued, "suggests a technique that could, if taught, save other crews who lose controls due to combat damage." The engineer nodded. "We want to reconstruct exactly what you did, in detail." Arthur realized they weren't here to question him. They were here to learn from him. His crash landing wasn't just luck. It was now being treated as a new emergency procedure, one that could apply to bombers hit by flak, fighters with damaged control lines, aircraft with burned wings, torn hydraulic systems on jammed control surfaces. The officer leaned forward. "Lieutenant, with your permission, we'd like to name this method." Arthur raised an eyebrow. "What would you call it, sir?" The officer smiled slightly. "The Ward method." Arthur didn't respond. He wasn't a hero in his own eyes. He was just a pilot who refused to let his crew die. But the RAF had already made their decision. This wouldn't be the last time he heard that name. The RAF wasted no time. Arthur's crash landing wasn't filed away as a miracle or an exception. It was treated as combat data, something that could mean the difference between life and death for hundreds of aircrews. Within 48 hours, RAF engineers and instructors were in a hangar with Arthur, examining a damaged practice aircraft while taking notes. They rebuilt the sequence step by step. 1. Total control. Loss simulation. 2. Trim-only pitch adjustments. 3. Differential thrust for steering. 4. Compensation for asymmetric drag. 5. Emergency belly landing technique. Every detail mattered. For the first time, the RAF officially mapped out how a pilot could remain airborne and even land without traditional flight controls. Engineers were stunned by one fact. Most aircraft still had manual trim systems that could survive electrical failure or fire. No one had considered using them for full flight control until Arthur. "Iman, a new training module is created." By the end of the week, a new emergency lesson began appearing in training briefings. Uncontrolled aircraft recovery ward method. Instructors introduced the scenario to young pilots. What to do if elevators are gone? What to do if ailerons are burned? What to do if the rudder is destroyed? How to stay level with trim? How to turn with engine power? How to prepare a belly landing with no flaps ups? Most recruits couldn't believe it was possible. Some thought it was theoretical, until they watched Arthur's crash film photos and heard the recorded testimonies of his crew. Suddenly, it was no longer theory. It was a real, battlefield-tested solution. But even Reports start coming in from the front. 2 months later, something unexpected happened. Telegram after telegram arrived at RAF operations. Pilot used Ward method. Returned aircraft. Plane damaged by flak. Landed using trim. Control lines. Severed crew survived using new technique. Bombers that would have ditched into the sea were now limping home. Fighters that would have spiraled down were stabilizing long enough for pilots to bail out safely. The Ward method was saving crews exactly as the RAF hoped. Arthur received copies of the reports. He read every one of them quietly. He never boasted. He never claimed credit. He simply nodded and said, "Good. They made it. This talent is, but the enemy also takes notice." German intelligence eventually intercepted RAF technical bulletins referencing a new emergency landing technique. They didn't know the details, but they knew something had changed. British bombers were surviving damage that normally destroyed aircraft. Luftwaffe analysts sent warnings upward. RAF pilots now capable of limited flight, even with heavy control surface loss. Arthur had unintentionally altered the expectations of enemy pilots and anti-aircraft crews. No one planned it. No one predicted it. But one pilot's impossible landing was now influencing how both sides viewed combat damage and survival. And Arthur still had no idea what recognition was coming next. Weeks after the crash, Arthur was summoned again, this time to London. He assumed it was another technical interview, another briefing, another round of questions. It wasn't. He walked into a formal RAF hall, polished floors, rows of officers, and a table lined with documents and citations. A senior air marshal stepped forward. "Lieutenant Ward, please stand at attention." Arthur stiffened. The room fell silent. The air marshal unfolded a sheet of paper. "On behalf of the Royal Air Force and His Majesty's government, we recognize the extraordinary actions you took under extreme combat conditions." Arthur's eyebrows lifted slightly. This wasn't an interview. It was an award citation. The air marshal continued reading. "You maintained control of a heavily damaged aircraft after the total loss of primary flight controls. Kept 5 crewmen alive through an extended emergency descent. Executed an unpowered landing without visibility, and rescued an unconscious airman seconds before detonation." The officers around the hall nodded. "You additionally provided critical data that has contributed to a new survival method, already credited with saving multiple RAF crews." A second officer stepped forward, holding a small, velvet-lined case. Arthur felt a knot in his stomach. He'd seen these cases before, always in someone else's hands. "Lieutenant Ward," the air marshal said, "for exceptional courage, innovation under fire, and devotion to duty, you are hereby awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross." The medal was pinned to his uniform. It felt heavy more than metal, more than ribbon. It carried the weight of the crew he saved, the lives he protected, the flights that now had a chance because of what he discovered. The room applauded softly. Arthur didn't smile. He didn't puff his chest. He simply nodded once. Because in his mind, the only thing that mattered was this: every crewman who used the method and lived, every bomber that limped home instead of crashing into the channel. That was the real award. Down 9. Epilogue: A landing remembered. Arthur returned to combat duties later that month. He never spoke much about the crash, but flight instructors used his story for years. Pilots whispered the tale before missions. Survivors credited his discovery with giving them a second chance. And after the war, when historians compiled accounts of extraordinary landings, one entry always stood out. The burning bomber with no controls landed by Lieutenant Arthur Ward, RAF. A landing no one believed was possible. A landing that rewrote emergency procedures. A landing that saved aircrews who never knew his name. All because one pilot refused to give up control of an aircraft, even after the aircraft had stopped giving him any control at all. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story, Smash that like button, subscribe, and share with your friends. We post new World War II stories and historic events every day. Be part of the adventure and never miss a moment of history in action. Comment below which story you want to see next. Your suggestion could be featured in the next video. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story that will leave you amazed. Join us as we uncover the courage, tactics, and unbelievable events that shaped history